A ceasefire may be at hand for the people of Gaza. After 465 days of merciless bombing by the Israeli government, by the Israeli Defense Forces, a ceasefire may be at last at hand. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking once again with Layan Sima Fuleihan. She is a popular educator, the education director at the People's Forum, a lead organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine coalition. Layan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Brian.
The images are amazing, Layan. The images of people in Gaza right now after this terrible genocide. And that's what it is. So many people have died, at least 45,000, 100,000 plus wounded, most of the population displaced, all the universities blown up, the hospitals gone, destroyed. I mean, unbelievable. We've watched it in real time. A genocide being watched by the people of the world in real time. People around the world have gone to the streets saying, we stand with Palestine. But the war went on and on and on. But maybe a ceasefire is at hand. We want to talk to you about it. It's a multi-staged agreement. And we also want to talk about the mood of the Palestinian people, because right now in Gaza, people are in the streets.
The mood in Gaza right now is one of celebration, Brian. The images coming out of the Gaza Strip are so moving. You see people streaming into the streets, mingling with resistance fighters, families who have survived the past over 465 days of what you just described, the most horrific genocide that we've seen in modern times, in recent times. People are out in the streets among the rubble. In the destruction of the occupied Gaza territory, they're in the streets celebrating. There was this very moving video of one of the Al Jazeera journalists who was reporting live from one of the celebrations in the street, and he took off his helmet and he took off his vest, and he said, I can take these off for the first time now in 15 months. And the crowd lifted him onto their shoulders and carried him away while he was still reporting in celebration. And it's not just in Gaza, it's across Palestine, from Ramallah to Hebron to Nablus. All the parts of Palestine are filled with celebrations. Yemen is out in the streets. Jordan is out in the streets. And everyone across the world is breathing a sigh of relief and is congratulating each other. The ceasefire is long overdue, and you can see how much the world wanted it by the reaction that is taking place now in the cities and towns of the world.
You know, that's the Palestinian homes that have been destroyed. It's the Palestinian universities that have been destroyed. It's mostly Palestinians who have died or have been terribly wounded. And yet, you can see from the images of this celebrations, this is not a defeated people. There is a legendary steadfastness, resilience of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, having suffered the Nakba in May 1948, the ethnic cleansing. The Palestinian people and Palestine would not exist outside of struggle. Struggle, in fact, is what has allowed Palestine, generation after generation after generation, to exist. And the resilience and steadfastness has demonstrated itself once again. Was it mainly Palestinians who died? Yes. Was it mainly Palestinian homes that were destroyed? Yes. But this does not appear at all to be a defeated people. This does not look like Japan at the end of World War II or Germany at the end of World War II, the defeated powers. This is a people that obviously feels that something has been achieved, even though the suffering is so great.
Absolutely. The suffering is so great, and we still don't actually know how great it is until the ceasefire really takes effect, because the Palestinian people have not been able to actually account for the losses because of the ongoing bombardment. And this kind of bombardment, Brian, we can't overstate how horrific it was. By some calculations, 6 times as much of the amount of bombardment that was dropped on Hiroshima by the United States in the nuclear bombing. This is the amount of bombs, the comparable weight of the bombing that has been dropped on the people of Gaza. And you can see that this is not a defeated people. This is the Palestinian identity. It's resistance, resilience, steadfastness. Now the focus is going to be on rebuilding, reconstructing. People are joyously already returning. People are already going back to the rubble of their homes. We'll get into it, I'm sure, but the ceasefire is actually lays out many of the principal demands that the Palestinian resistance had since the beginning of this genocide. The return of people to their homes in the north, a significant prisoner exchange, a flow of aid, and a promise of reconstruction. All of these demands are, so far in what we can tell, outlined in the ceasefire agreement that was achieved now in this 15th month of genocide. This small, oppressed people who have had nothing but siege and blockade and aggression for decades and decades and decades has managed to continue negotiating from a position of strength, and a lot of that is due to that spirit, the culture of struggle and resistance that you were just referring to.
Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about. What does Biden say about the agreement? What does Donald Trump say about the agreement? What does Netanyahu and the Israelis say about the agreement? Again, what do the regional actors say about it? Again, we want to talk about what the Palestinian people say and the Palestinian resistance forces. We want to hear their voices. You know, the United States characterizes every Palestinian a resistance organization as a terrorist entity. So if you show solidarity with the Palestinian people, you're frequently labeled in the United States as aiding and abetting terrorism. I mean, the U.S. said the same thing about the ANC and Nelson Mandela in South Africa up until 1988, and even beyond, actually. But I want for our audience to hear what the Palestinian resistance forces say about this agreement. Now, first of all, it's a three-stage agreement. I want to go over the three stages with you, but let's first hear, if you have it, what did Hamas say about it? What is Islamic Jihad, another Palestinian resistance group? What did the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine? All of these organizations, again, identified as terrorist entities, such that the U.S. media and the U.S. people never hear, or the U.S. media never tells what they think, and the U.S. people never hear what they think. But I want people to hear what they're saying about the ceasefire agreement.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. Hamas has made official statement and also has had a few speeches from different members of the political bureau. They have announced the ceasefire agreement. They have said, I'm quoting here, the ceasefire agreement is the result of the legendary steadfastness of our great Palestinian people and our valiant resistance in the Gaza Strip over the course of more than 15 months. This agreement to halt the aggression is an achievement for our people, our resistance, our nation, and the free people of the world. It comes as part of our responsibility towards our steadfast and patient people in the proud Gaza Strip. They also announced in a speech just within the past hour that in their assessment, this ceasefire represents the achievement of all of their demands since the beginning of the genocide, and they laid out the framework of the ceasefire.
Okay.
Now, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had a very similar tone. They said, our people and their resistance are imposing an honorable agreement to stop the aggression, withdraw, and conduct an honorable prisoner exchange due to their legendary steadfastness and brave and valiant fighters. They also mourn the righteous martyrs, and they look forward to healing the wounds of the Palestinian people and extend greetings to all of the steadfast fighters in the Gaza Strip. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine released a statement just before the official announcement of the ceasefire, where they condemned the ongoing assassinations and bombardments that Israel was still carrying out today. The
Israelis using a drone assassinated a Palestinian journalist as he was announcing a ceasefire,
just
right?
after he was those moments right before the ceasefire, it kept getting closer and closer. The whole world, people of Gaza were like, it's going to be announced over the past couple of days. No one has slept for the past couple of days, and this young journalist was speaking live on his social media saying, I'm so excited for the ceasefire to be announced. And then just after that, he was assassinated. Horrific.
By a drone strike.
Yes. And over the past, I think, a couple of days, more than 86 Palestinians have been killed in bombardments, and it was going right up until the ceasefire was officially announced.
So the PFLP statement condemns that, and how do they characterize the ceasefire?
They say that this is right before it was announced. They said, amid this continued aggression, which is the ongoing bombardment, the Palestinian resistance factions are intensifying their efforts to halt this aggression as soon as possible. War criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, mired in his failures and defeats, will ultimately find himself and his fascist government compelled to agree to a ceasefire after their catastrophic failure to achieve any of their objectives beyond inflicting death and destruction on unarmed civilians.
All right. Well, let's talk about the three stages of the agreement, and then there's a lot of speculation. None of us were a fly on the wall, obviously. We weren't in those negotiations rooms, but there's a lot of talk that this agreement parallels an agreement that was close at hand, but that the Israelis nixed at the last moment. That was back in May 2024.
Yes.
So here we are, 7 months later, essentially the same agreement, but there are a few changes, at least as we interpret it. But let's talk about the three stages and what's in the agreement, and then I want to talk to you after that about the difference between now and May. Why did the Israelis, if they are indeed coming to the table, signing the agreement, why are they doing it now and not May? But let's start with the terms of the agreement, the three stages.
Absolutely. So the three, we're as close as we can know, because there's a variety of different leaks of what the terms of the actual agreement are. Many of them have been corroborated multiple times. So we feel that this is a pretty accurate representation of what the ceasefire outlines. Even Biden himself, and of course he has an interest in this, but he said it's basically exactly the same as May. It seems to be mostly the same except for a few small appendixes. But we'll find out in the coming days exactly the terms and the precise numbers. But the phase is very similar. It's a three-phase agreement. The first phase, we have the most information about it because it's going to start soon. It's officially going to start on the 19th. There's a cessation of aggression.
19th of January.
Of January on Sunday. We don't know the 0 hour yet, but that will be announced, I'm sure, soon after tomorrow's deliberations in the Israeli Security Cabinet. Now, the first phase is going to last 42 days. Already there's been a cessation of aggression, but it's officially going to start.
6 weeks, 42 days is phase one. And as of right now, even though it's only announced and hasn't been approved by the Israeli cabinet, as of now, there's cessation. As you talked about, crowds in Gaza mingling with resistance fighters are out actually celebrating. So
out celebrating
it appears a cessation. And then the actual agreement goes into effect January 19th, one day before Donald Trump becomes president.
Yes.
So what's in phase one?
So in phase one, there's multiple things. One is a prisoner exchange. So 33 of the Israelis who are being held captive in Gaza would be released. That would be women and elderly and injured. They will be released in return for a large number of Palestinian prisoners. We know that it will be about 1,000 Palestinians who have been basically kidnapped from the Gaza territory since October 7, 2023.
These are people, Palestinians who have been arrested since October 7th.
Those horrific scenes of the Israeli occupation rounding up men and forcing them to strip down and walk in the rubble and be subjected to torture and be placed in these detention camps without any tracking of who they are.
Noteworthy, Layan, that these people, these 1,000 plus Palestinians who have been taken captive since October 7th are not called hostages. They're just called Palestinian prisoners, but they're hostages.
Of course.
So these people are going to be released.
1,000 of these people will be released. There will also be others who are released from the Israeli prisons. There will also be some number, and it's a little bit unclear, but some number of people who are released who are serving life sentences in Israeli prisons. Now, these are political prisoners, Brian. Every single Palestinian who's in a Israeli prison is a political prisoner. It's illegal for Israel to be jailing people of another country, of another nation, in international law. These are political prisoners. These are prisoners taken under conditions of occupation and colonial control. Now, when someone's in there for a life sentence, this means they're sentenced for their political activity, their resistance activity.
They are the leaders.
Their leadership. So the prisoner exchange will also include, we don't know who, but a number of names from that category. Now, besides the prisoner exchange, and And the prisoner exchange itself is significant, and it's going to happen along the stages as well. 33 Israeli captives will be released in the first phase, then another number in the second phase, and then possibly the bodies of those hostages that were killed majority of them were killed by the Israeli bombardment itself will also be exchanged, but that's still under negotiation. The prisoner release itself, Brian, is a huge achievement for the Palestinian people. You can't overstate the amount of optimism that it brings to the Palestinian people. The prisoner question for the Palestinian struggle is a central one. I think it's difficult for people who are getting their information from the U.S. media to really see that impact, the kind of joy that is accompanied by a prisoner release, by people
because
returning home.
everybody is either has a family member or a friend who's in prison.
There's no Palestinian family that doesn't know someone who has been taken from them and that's being held in these conditions of torture in these Israeli prisons. So the prisoner release itself is such a huge achievement that everyone is celebrating right now. On top of that, there's also going to be a staged withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza territory. Right now...
And again, this is all stage one.
All stage one. Right now, they're all over the Gaza territory. They're still in active combat. Just since the past couple of days, maybe the past week, at least 14 Israeli soldiers have been killed in active fight with the Palestinian resistance. So they're still all there. They've closed off the possibility for people who've been displaced from the north to return to the north by setting up basically a border on the Netzarim axis, which goes right south of Gaza City.
So it divides Gaza east to west, dividing people, basically a wall so people can't go home to the north.
To the north, yes. They cannot go back to the north. If you remember, and we've talked about it on the Socialist program before, one of the proposals that was the ideas that the Israeli military establishment was circulating was something called the General's Plan, where they would find some way to occupy a significant area of the north of Gaza to create a buffer zone. They would depopulate it either through massacring people or displacing people, ethnically cleanse the north of its Palestinian population so they could use it as a buffer zone. That is being thrown out the window with this agreement because in the first stage, after 7 days of the implementation of the first phase of this agreement, the corridor will be open for people to return to their homes in the north by foot, and then after that, they will be able to return by vehicle.
And Israeli soldiers will leave this corridor.
They will be leaving this corridor in a staged manner. And so they'll start leaving it in the beginning of the agreement, and then they will continue leaving it until the second phase, where it seems to be that in the second phase they will be fully leaving that part, the Netzarim axis here, south of Gaza City. People will be searched on their return because the condition is that they return without arms, without weapons. And it seems like the search will be done by some sort of security company or force that is determined by the mediators of this agreement. So we don't know the conditions of it, but essentially people are returning to the north. On top of it, they'll also start to remove their forces from the Philadelphia axis, which the corridor, the southern border that the border between Rafah in the south and Egypt, where the majority of supplies and aid, medicine, people going back and forth, all really happened through that crossing.
Netanyahu said the Israelis were never going to leave that corridor.
And that's why the May ceasefire negotiations failed, because Netanyahu said he would never give up control of the border between Gaza and Egypt. Now, and he promised the Israeli people that he would never give up control. In the ceasefire agreement, he's giving up control. They will gradually reduce forces, and after the release of the last hostage from the first stage, they will complete their full withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor no later than the 50th day, so a couple days into the second phase. But they will have a full withdrawal from the Rafah border crossing, and there will be an immediate, once the ceasefire comes into effect, aid flowing in up to 600 trucks a day. Egypt is already working on a mechanism to make this happen, according to Egyptian officials. And people will be able to move back and forth, also in a phased manner, through that border crossing, including wounded fighters will be able to go to seek treatment. A lot of people need medical treatment. So many people need medical treatment. We'll be able to start going to Egypt to receive that treatment.
So the reconstruction of Gaza is also part of the agreement. As I was looking at what we're seeing, and again, we don't know all the details, but we're starting to be able to piece it together. It looks like a 3 to 5 year reconstruction campaign. Obviously, all of all of Gaza has to be rebuilt. So the third phase is the murkiest phase. Obviously, the Israelis didn't want to have this agreement before. Now they've been compelled to do it. We're going to talk about why. What are the pressures on Netanyahu that brought him to the table in a different way than he was, say, in May 2024 when he nixed the deal? But I want to give a sense of the tone and tenor of the incoming U.S. administration. Trump right now is claiming credit for it. He said a week ago, all hell is going to break loose unless there's an agreement and the hostages are released by the day I take office. Well, the Israeli hostages, will not be released by the day he takes office, but there will be a process whereby they can be released, and some of them will start to be released.
And he was the first political official to declare the ceasefire. He came out ahead of Biden. He came out ahead of everyone to say ceasefire has been reached. He really was trying to claim it.
Yeah. So, but then if you listen to his national security advisor, incoming, Mike Waltz, or Pete Hegseth, who today at his confirmation hearings, I think it was today, it might have been yesterday, but at his confirmation hearings was talking about, we want to kill every member of Hamas. This is this kind of mentality and rhetoric of the incoming Trump foreign policy team. I want to play a clip from Mike Waltz. It's not long, it's about 30 seconds, but it says at least what they're telling their own base about what their intention is, and it's not about peace. Let's listen.
And from your perspective, if this deal goes through and we enter what's characterized as the first phase, does that effectively mean the war is over? Does a ceasefire mean that its work is done in Gaza for the foreseeable future?
Well, I certainly think Hamas would like to believe that, but we've been clear that Gaza has to be fully demilitarized. Hamas has to be destroyed to the point that it cannot reconstitute.
Well, what I really am curious about is are these just the warrior words of the incoming war hawks in the Trump cabinet, or do they, meaning that they're sort of face-saving gestures on their part, or are they actually determined to go right back to war again against Hamas and the other resistance forces in Gaza? I mean, Waltz says, we're going to destroy Hamas. Now, the Israelis have spent the last 465 days using every weapon at their disposal to destroy Hamas. That didn't happen. So in a way, I think this is fanciful talk by, cowboy imperialists who are like, we're going to do it. We didn't do it this time in this last 465 days, but we're going to do it. And yet at the same time, the Trump administration and Trump himself made it clear he didn't want to be saddled with an ongoing war in Gaza. He wanted basically a clean slate. That was what Trump was trying to do. Trump has a different agenda. It's a bad agenda. We can talk about it. It's a billionaire's agenda. It's a pro-war agenda. But he wanted to get this over with. So it seems to me that Mike Waltz is basically, huffing and puffing and talking like an extreme militarist. It shows their intent. It shows actually their genocidal intent. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. and Israel are about to go back to war, because ultimately Israel is also losing something. As a matter of fact, they've lost a lot. And I think this speaks to the pressure on the Netanyahu government. And Netanyahu himself may not be the head of state for that much longer in Israel. He's just ultimately a politician who can be replaced. But there are pressures. The Israelis lost more soldiers. There's pressures internally in Israel. There's a lot of people leaving Israel. And the world right now, basically, the narrative has shifted so much. People hate Israel the way they hated the racist South African apartheid government in the late 1980s. And public opinion matters. Anyway, let's talk about what's really underneath the sort of the decision by the Israelis to change their tune since May 2024.
Well, there's a lot of different factors that I'm sure have played into it in one way or another. And some of this is speculation, trying to read between the lines of what different officials are saying, different members of the incoming Trump team, the Biden administration, Netanyahu's government. But Trump definitely was a factor. And there's members of his team, Waltz, Hegseth, others who are talking like this, who have called for the annexation of the West Bank. There were some reports on Israeli media over the past couple of days as we were all watching the negotiations play out and trying to read the signs. Some of the Israeli media was reporting that there had been some sort of understanding between Trump, his team, and Netanyahu that basically Trump would support a renewal of the aggression against the Palestinian people, also the annexation of the West Bank, growth of the settlement project. I don't know if that's true.
After a ceasefire.
After a ceasefire. Essentially that they wouldn't really move beyond the first phase. After the hostage exchange, that they could go back to fighting. That's what a lot of the far-right members of Netanyahu's government are saying. They themselves may be saying that also to save face, because they were the ones who were staunchly against any ceasefire deal over the past year. And now they've watered down their objection a little bit. They're saying it's a terrible deal, that Netanyahu's selling out, he's backing down on his promises, but they're not threatening in the same way to leave the government like they were doing back in May and all the other rounds of the negotiation. So it could be hot air. But if we actually look at who Trump is and the policies that he's actually tried to carry out in the Arab region last time he was in the president's office, there's no way he's trying to actually create good conditions for the Palestinian people. Trump is a billionaire with a billionaire's agenda. He wants to make deals that will help him and his friends get richer. The deal of the century was his proposal last time, which would have included annexing large parts of the West Bank, reorganizing the division of territory, in which the Palestinians would lose a lot and would be ever more fragmented. It would further fragment the already fragmented Palestinian territories right now. It would not move them towards a state. It would actually fragment people based on economic zones, production activities, things like that, maximizing the extraction of profit from the occupation of the Palestinian people. Trump is a deal maker. I think that the ceasefire is great for his image. He wants to be seen as the guy who's going to make good deals. He's going to make more deals in favor of the American economy, so he says, that's going to line the pockets of the ultra-rich that are coming into the White House with him. So this may be a moment in which he proves that he is a deal maker, that he tries to prove to the American public that he really is against war. But I don't know that that means that his administration is going to take on policies in favor of a sustained solution for the Palestinian people.
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. You know, it also represents this whole thing represents the catastrophic failure of the Biden administration. When we've talked about this a lot, but I want to emphasize it right now. Biden and Antony Blinken, they're all saying, see, we've strengthened American foreign policy. We're making America stronger. We're allowing Donald Trump, the incoming president, who up until like 6 months ago, they said he was a threat to democracy and he may be a fascist and, you know, like sort of an existential threat to America. But now they're like, no, we're giving him a stronger hand to play with. That's what Biden is saying. There are recent polls that indicate that as many as 20% of the people who didn't vote for Biden didn't vote for Biden because of Gaza, because of the genocide, because of the mass movement, the horrors of the genocide, which people could watch on their smartphones, and the mass movement in the United States that made solidarity with Palestinian people and with Gaza and against the genocide something very tangible and very real, a real factor in American politics. But all this time, Biden could have said to Netanyahu, we're not going to give you one more penny, not one more dime, not one more nickel. We're not going to allow you to get one more missile or bomb unless you come and sign this deal. And they didn't do that. And now they're congratulating themselves and Trump. They're actually, in a way, even acknowledging that Trump was a factor because they said, yeah, we brought him into the negotiations. So here, I'm saying this for all the progressive people in the country who think, oh, we hate Donald Trump so much, he's so reactionary, this is why we have to support the Democratic Party or Biden or Harris. Like, these people are a complete dead end in terms of progressive politics, and if anything, just facilitate the rise of Trumpism. And again, they have the shared objectives, which you can see. They are equally embracing all of the imperialist objectives of the empire.
Absolutely. Biden said in his statements today that his team and the Trump team worked as one, like the American people do. I mean, that's a pretty significant shift from the earlier kinds of statements they were making towards Trump. Blinken, in his remarks to the Atlantic Council just recently, said that they had successfully averted a regional war. He said the Biden administration had made the world a better place, and they had successfully averted a regional war. Brian, they actually exponentially increased the breadth of the war on Palestine across the region. They attacked Yemen. They supported the attack of Syria. They supported the complete attack on Lebanon. They've done so much to basically, and they've said now that they're handing the world over to Trump. This is the formulation that Blinken uses. We are handing the world over to Trump in a stronger and better place. It's kind of shocking.
No, but it's such a lesson. As if the world belongs to them, and now it's going to belong to Donald Trump. And, he also, Blinken said, we can't allow the strategic gains of the past 15 months to be ephemeral, to be short-lived. That's what Blinken said yesterday. Well, what are the strategic gains? Well, yeah, they took out the Assad government. They feel they weakened, and they did weaken, Hezbollah within the context of Lebanon. I think they feel that they Israel successfully carried out aggression against Iran without igniting a bigger regional war. They're bombing the hell out of Yemen right now. So Blinken says, well, this was a great strategic step forward for us. That's how he is characterizing the genocide. Because bottom line is, this is a genocide. I mean, let's take the most conservative numbers here. 45,000 people dead in Gaza. It's really many more, because those are the people who died because of bombs and missiles and bullets.
And those are the people who have been able to be registered in the Gaza Ministry of Health, which, Brian, there's no more functioning hospitals.
Yeah.
It's impossible. There's some estimates now that are saying it's up to 16% of the population has been killed.
All right, so let's take 16%. Right now, the 45,000 dead in a population of 2.1 million is about 2%. The United States is a country of 340 million people. Let's just give the lowest number, the 2.1%, the 2%. 2% of 340 million would be 6.8 million Americans killed in a 15-month period if it was, if we were able to take those numbers and apply them to a U.S. population subset that large. If it's 16% of the population, that's 8 times greater than that. 8 times greater. So this is genocide. And then the other thing is there are a lot of people who died because they couldn't get water. They couldn't get drinkable water. All the babies who maybe they weren't, killed because a bomb dropped on them, but they had completely treatable infant-like ailments, but there's no medicine. There's no clean drinking water. So we don't even know the dimensions of it. And here Blinken has said, like, the strategic gains. The strategic gains. This is the thinking and the language of the Democratic Party imperialists, just like Mike Waltz and the Republican Party imperialists. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that while we're looking at this agreement and we're sort of contemplating, well, will the agreement hold? Is Mike Waltz telling the truth when he says we're going to destroy Hamas? there's another element that we have to think about. We're not talking about this because we're pundits. We're not talking about this because we're interested observers. We are part of the organization of the movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Let's take Mike Waltz for his word. They want to destroy the Palestinian people. So what do we as a movement do at the moment that there's a ceasefire? Yes, the people in Gaza are a sigh of relief because maybe this genocide will end. A sign of pride that the resilience and steadfastness of the people has endured and they're not going away. They're not defeated. But for us, in the global movement in solidarity with Palestine, we can't let down right now. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep mobilizing.
We have to actually increase our mobilization, increase the fight that we're carrying out here, because that is going to make a very big difference. The isolation of Israel on the world stage was a factor, I think was a factor in this historical process of this past 15 months that led to, it's one of the many factors that led to the difference between when we looked at this agreement in May and when we looked at it now. One of the things that Trump is thinking about, one of the things that Biden is thinking about, that Biden has suffered from, one of the things that all the players are thinking about. And now more than ever, because we know just from, if we don't even want to go back into history, we can just look at a couple of months ago, the ceasefire that was initiated between Lebanon and Israel. Israel violates that ceasefire every single day. There's some speculation that they won't actually withdraw fully. It's unclear right now, but they're not really holding up the terms, and they're consistently violating the ceasefire. So, and that's with U.S. backing, with U.S. support, with U.S. weapons, with U.S. intelligence, with all the U.S. is right behind them. So the question of implementation of the ceasefire, the mediators and the enforcers of the ceasefire are the United States, who is not a objective party to this. It is fully on the side of Israel. The UAE, Qatar, Egypt, all of these are not fully objective mediators. They all have their own interests, and very rarely do they truly lie with the liberation cause of the Palestinian people. So it's the role of the movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people to be that voice of conscience and to interpret for the general public what's actually going on. We need to actually hold Israel and the United States to account. They agreed to a ceasefire. They need to actually uphold those terms. We will be watching and we will be clarifying for people what happens. That's the role of the movement, and we have to actually increase our activity.
And when you think about this long term, Israel is basically a small country with a very big military because it's an extension of the American military. It's the extension of the biggest military power in the history of the human race, also known as the Pentagon. But Israeli society is divided. It's divided politically, and also because it is a small country and basically a settler regime, not in the 17th century or 16th century like North America or Australia or New Zealand or Canada. This is like we're in the contemporary era. And the Israeli population, many of them have a second passport. Many of them have a third passport. If Israel's reputation in the world is one associated with apartheid and racism and genocide, the way the South African regime was such a reviled regime. South Africans couldn't really travel anywhere without getting the wrath of white South Africans, without getting the wrath of people saying, like, you are modern day fascists. A lot of people in Israel don't want to live like with that reputation either, and they have options. They can leave. Many of them are leaving.
Many of them are leaving, and on top of it, it's a settler society in the contemporary times. People who are settling the Palestinian territory, who are coming in to build the project of Israel, besides the kind of extreme fanatic type, settlers who are going out and encroaching and trying to expand the Israeli territory and are willing to kind of live like they're carrying out armed struggle. The majority of people, they expect conditions of life like Europe, like the average European or more.
A privileged life.
A privileged life. They all, most of them have second passports. Many of them come from New York and from U.S. Cities, and they want a comparable lifestyle. the Israeli economy has taken a massive hit since the beginning of the genocide because it is a state that basically is just an army. Every single person has to serve in the military from age 17. On top of it, there's so many people who are reservists. And people did not sign up for this. They signed up for a comfy, privileged life comparable to their experiences in other Western countries. And that can't be sustained for very long. People they're suffering economically. They're scared because of all the fear-mongering that their own government is creating for them. Some of them have had to leave because they left in parts closer to Lebanon. Many of them have been deployed and have to go fight. And there's been exposés of the extreme violence that these the military personnel are carrying out, and the violent consciousness that has been just built into the consciousness of Israeli society, the brutal things that they say and that they do while they're killing and massacring Palestinian people. But there's also high rates of mental illness, people who are refusing to go do their military assignments. A large percentage of reservists are not showing up to their post. People who are actively engaged in the military. There was a letter the past week of 800 parents of active military members said they will refuse to allow their children to go back to actual armed activity in Gaza, that they're refusing to allow their children to take up their military duties as they're described. People don't want to do this.
And many people who are not friendly to the Palestinians in Israel, really not supportive of the Palestinian people at all, but they hold Netanyahu responsible and the right wing responsible for dragging this war out to these 465 days, where if the Israelis and if Netanyahu had early on entered into negotiations, a vast number of the Israeli hostages could have been released a long time ago and would have been alive and would have been healthy. I mean, the hostage families in Israel tried to organize and did organize protests and so on, but there weren't that many of them perhaps. And also, Netanyahu was getting so many kudos, both from the Western press, from the U.S., and from the right-wing Israeli media, which is most of the media. There's some liberal media, but it's not the mainstream, certainly in Israel. Kudos for having, carried out a terrorist action against the Hezbollah when they put explosive devices into 5,000, explosive materials into 5,000 pagers, so that so many people were blinded or lost their hands or fingers. And the Israeli government was like, wow, we did it. Look at our technological prowess. And our enemies are naked. And the fact that they could assassinate Nasrallah and other top central tiers of the Hezbollah leadership. These were considered like kudos, like a feather in Netanyahu's cap. Like, this was great. But there's another part of the Israeli population which, while not actually in solidarity with the Palestinian people at all, that wasn't their priority. Their priority was not how Benjamin Netanyahu looked. Their priority was to end the war and to get the hostages back. So there are cleavages inside of Israeli society, the ability of Israelis to leave. World public opinion has changed. Even the Israeli soccer team, football team, hooligans who were like snatching Palestinian flags in Europe, well, people in Europe answered them. They were like, no, you're here. We're not going to allow you. And then anybody who resisted them was castigated in the American media and the Israeli media as being anti-Semitic when they were just standing up to like violent thugs. Anyway, the world has changed since October 7th. It's changed for Gaza in a horrible way. So many deaths, so much destruction, so many wounds, all of it. We know all of that. The destruction of the hospitals and the universities. But the world political situation has changed in a way that's very, very unfavorable long-term for the Zionist project, which is a settler colonial project in the contemporary era. And I think when we look back at October 7th, I know some people, and I think some people even in the U.S. have said, well, the resistance forces shouldn't have done it. They shouldn't have taken up arms. They shouldn't have tried to, break out of the open-air prison known as Gaza, that it wasn't worth it, and so on. And whatever, the Palestinian people will determine their own course. They have self-determination as their right. But the fact of the matter is that prior to October 7th, on October 6th, or any of the days before that, the U.S. imperialist ruling class establishment was intent on extinguishing the flame of Palestinian freedom and sovereignty by normalizing Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands. Palestine, West Bank, the parts of Palestine that were not occupied in 1948, the West Bank and Gaza, for instance, or the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria, they were seized in a 6-day war in 1967. They were seized at that time. And now with the normalization of relations, which was what Trump was planning with the reactionary Arab monarchs, regimes in the Gulf, and then other Arab governments like the Egyptian government that had already normalized relations with Israel, the goal was to make Palestine completely isolated such that the Palestinian people would, over time, have to be defeated. But since October 7th, the world has changed, and I think this is the big picture that I want to get at. Gaza has changed for the worse. The world has changed in a way that has rejected Zionism and the Zionist expansionist plans to destroy the Palestinian people. So, as Dr. Martin Luther King says, as Eugene Puryear has mentioned on our show, the arc of the universe is long, but it tends to bend in the direction of justice. Well, it doesn't bend by itself. People bend it. And this struggle, with all of its terribleness, has also created a sense, an arc of justice for the Palestinian people that I believe is irreversible. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts on that.
I agree with you. I mean, the changes, the transformation of the way people understand Palestine, Gaza has become in many ways the center of the struggle against imperialism, and it has rapidly expanded the people who see themselves as part of that struggle. It has, what has happened over the past 15 months has on the one hand shown the nobleness of the Palestinian cause, the true intention of the Palestinian people who are fighting for their right to live on their land, fighting against an occupation, an imperialist, colonialist occupation that is the most brutal, that will go to any means to attempt to exterminate the resistance. And the fact that the Palestinian people have resisted this and have deflected Israel and the United States from achieving their military objectives, that is a huge inspiration to people. It changes the way you can see the future. For many young people in the United States, for example, they have never known a day when the United States is not at war, whether or not it's being spoken about in the media. The idea that the U.S. isn't in control of all territories on the world can feel like it's an inevitability. But what October 7 did was, and since then, was one, destroy the image of U.S. imperialism as some sort of benevolent force that's keeping the world order together. It destroyed it completely. The American people don't have trust in or see the White House as a legitimate moral authority anymore. The people of the world do not see it that way either. It creates a level of doubt every time Biden or now Trump or Blinken or Rubio or anyone in the current or next administration is going to go out and say this is what's happening. People are going to second guess it. They're going to say, why are you saying that? Because they've lived through the past 15 months where they've seen on their phones the massacre of unarmed civilians, of children, mass starvation, all with the tax money of American citizens and the budget of the United States. So it's completely exposed the agenda of U.S. imperialism. That is irreversible. People, when they go through that experience, they only get more and more consciousness. They don't go backwards. Once you see it, you can't forget it. And it's a massive, massive change. I don't think we can really understate how important that is for the long arc of the Palestinian liberation struggle. Because it was never going to be won in one battle. I mean, it's going up against the wealthiest, mightiest militaries of the world. But now when the U.S. is reshaping the Middle East, when they're trying to carry out their plan to reshape the Middle East, they have to do it in a context in which they are seen for what they truly are, imperialist, brutal, monstrous, genocidal force. It's going to be much more difficult for them to get the legitimacy to complete their project than it was before. And the right to resist occupation and colonization and imperialism is now undeniable. The Palestinian people put that back on the table. The question of struggling against your occupiers is no longer a question. People saw how important it is. They understand that. This is also an irreversible fact.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us just to take a moment to parse the language, because obviously October 7th was a violent act. You know, when the Palestinian fighters came into what is called the State of Israel, that's a violent act. And anybody who, you know, wants a new world would prefer the world to be peaceful. They would prefer the world not to have violence. But when the Israelis routinely bomb Gaza, which they've done, you know, over and over again. I mean, there have been many, many wars, even in the last 20 years, where thousands of people in Gaza have been destroyed.
They call it mowing the lawn operations.
They call it, the Israelis use this sort of clinical term. We're mowing the lawn, meaning we're going to cut down the resistance. We're going to, from time to time, we have to mow the lawn. That's not called terrorism. It's not even actually called violence. It's always called self-defense. Now, when the Palestinians came across the wall into Israel on October 7th, they were coming into a part of historic Palestine that had been Palestinian villages, homes, wooden homes and stone homes that were either burned to the ground if they were wood, or shattered, broken up if they were stone by the Israelis. All of the Arab villages in that area, right outside of Gaza, were destroyed as part of the Israeli military's orders after 1948. So it would be the Palestinian people going back to their homes that had been demolished, violently demolished. And again, use the language violence. Why is that never described as violence? It's called Israeli independence in the media. That was violence. That was violence. Now, in 2018, the Palestinian resistance forces in Gaza wanted to do something that was nonviolent in the same area, the same wall that was breached on October 7th. What did they do? Every Friday they came and they had these big nonviolent protests. They were called the Great March of Return, meaning they could look over the wall and say, we want to go home. Those are our homes. Those are our villages. So they used this kind of symbolic, performative, peaceful protests. And the Israeli military shot them. They sniped them. They shot them many times in the legs or the arms, but frequently in the head or the chest. They killed people in wheelchairs at the Great Wall of Return.
They killed the emergency medical aid people coming in to treat the wounded from that had been shot from the protests. And what
did the U.S. government and the U.S. media say about the Great March of Return, the peaceful protest in the same area? They said nothing. They didn't condemn it. They didn't criticize it. They were like, the complicated Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So then the Palestinians have no ability to have a peaceful protest because they're being shot down by the Israeli Defense Forces. So the option then is, if all peaceful protest avenues were closed, picking up the gun also becomes the only available option. Now, George Washington picked up the gun. I'm very sure King George III would have branded George Washington a terrorist. John Brown picked up the gun against the system of slavery, and the American government sent Robert E. Lee, who at that time was the head of the U.S. military, to suppress it because John Brown was the terrorist, not the slave owners who imposed violence every day, every hour, every minute to maintain a system of slavery. They were never characterized as terrorists or violent. So I want to say all these things, not that they're not obvious, but they need to be said, because when we talk about language and the language of violence, the language of terrorism, we also have to recognize that the language of the imperialists always whitewashes their own violence, which is constant. And when you scale it up between the violence of the oppressed, the colonized, and the violence of the oppressors, the colonizers, there's no comparison. Again, it's really important when we're fighting this battle of ideas about the narrative to reject the notion that Palestinian resistance equals terrorism and Israeli violence, American violence equals self-defense. These terms are flawed.
Exactly, and they've been redefined by the imperialist agenda to serve their own interests. And I think it's also important to look at history. There's no struggle of the colonized or of the oppressed that didn't have to use armed struggle, armed means, violent means, also to put pressure to achieve their goals, to beat back the boot of the power that was oppressing them. If you are being imprisoned in an open air prison, if you're being told you can't move, you can't have medicine, you can't have water, by somebody blocking you from going back to your house, separating you from your family, are you going to just accept it? No, you can't, of course. And the Palestinian struggle for liberation has always relied on multiple means, not just armed struggle. The Great March of Return is a perfect example of this. The tradition of popular mobilizations, of manifestations, protests, going up to the apartheid wall in the West Bank, going right up to the wall and protesting against it and suffering from the tear gas, from the shooting, assassinations, from imprisonment and raids. People use all forms of struggle. They use cultural forms of struggle. The apartheid wall is covered in beautiful resistance art. The production of Palestinian revolutionary and liberatory literature and art and music cannot be compared to any other production of revolutionary literature, I think, in any other location of struggle. I mean, the diversity of forms of resistance is so huge. So to condemn the Palestinian resistance as terrorists is completely false. All it does is serve to mask the fact that it's actually the Israeli occupation and its U.S. backers that are that are the greatest sponsors of terrorism across the world.
Occupation is illegal. Also, in the UN, in international law, the right of the oppressed living under illegal occupation to resist, including armed resistance, is codified into international law. It's part of UN resolutions. This language struggle, the struggle over words, will be reflective of the larger struggle between oppressed peoples and oppressed classes and those who are oppressing them. That's not going to stop. I just want to, as we get towards the finish line, I want to just recontextualize what's going on. The war against the Palestinian people is not new. The Nakba, May 1948, the terrible ethnic cleansing, hundreds of thousands of people driven from their homes, the use of massacres by Zionist violent gangs in 1948. We know about that. And then it continued. The seizure or the invasion of Egypt and the seizure of other Arab lands by the Israelis with the support of Britain and France at that time in 1956. In 1967 was a turning point. It was a 6-day war against Egypt, Syria, and the others, as we talked about. 6 days. In 6 days, Gaza was seized. In 6 days, the West Bank was seized. In 6 days, the Golan Heights were seized, and now they've been annexed from Syria. In 6 days, the Sinai was seized and Egypt had a massive army. In 6 days, the Israelis did this. After 465 days, not in Egypt, not in these other places, but against this little strip of land, against the people concentrated in this little strip of land called Gaza. After 465 days, there is a negotiated end to the war. It's not If this was a complete victory for Israel, as the U.S. is going to try to present it, there would not have been a negotiated end. Complete victories include unconditional surrender imposed on the defeated party. But instead, the Israelis have come back to the negotiating table, and they've actually changed the position from May 2024 in a way that the deal is actually better for the Palestinian side. That doesn't mean I don't want to use language sort of either hyperbolically or in a Pollyannish way, like something wonderful has happened. The terrible genocide that we witnessed is something that the Palestinian people, their families, their villages, their communities, their towns, their cities, whole generations will be scarred by this. But what's obvious, Layan, and I want to end on this, is that even the American government is now recognizing that not only were the resistance forces in Palestine not fully defeated, but all of those who have been killed, the ranks of those who have been killed are being filled up by the next generation. If you see your mother, your brother, your father, your cousin massacred, and you're 8 years old or 10 years old or 14 years old, you're not going to think at the end of the day with the ceasefire, oh, great. You're going to think like, I'm going to keep fighting for my people, because this steadfastness, this resilience is actually part of the psychology of the entire people. And that's what makes the Palestinian struggle sort of the detonator for a global struggle for all of those people who feel oppressed, who are exploited. In that sense, this is a battle, not the last battle, but a battle, terrible battle, but a battle that leads to other struggles for freedom and liberation and emancipation. And I think that people in the United States have a duty, an obligation, and a challenge to play their role in helping the Palestinian people win that kind of freedom, because it's the government that speaks in our name, not necessarily with our consent, but certainly in our name, that does all of this with Israel, again, facilitating genocide and oppression. So you get the last word.
Well, Brian, this is an important note to end on. I think that we have to be very clear about what's going on, and be very clear that when the United States comes out and says that Hamas has been defeated, Hamas has been weakened, you were referring to Blinken's comments at the Atlantic Council again. He said that Hamas can never be militarily defeated because the ranks have filled again. The same number of people that have been killed have been recruited over the past 15 months. He was admitting, in many ways, defeat. It's an irony of history that the greatest imperialist powers throughout history can't seem to learn from the mistakes of their own past, or from the past of other empires. Because when you try to oppress a people or a nation, it creates the conditions for people to pick up the resistance banner. It inspires more people to fight. There's no situation in which the United States and Israel could exterminate the spirit of resistance by killing people. Over the past 15 months, they have effectively killed untold numbers and maimed and wounded many more. But they have actually worked against themselves in terms of growing the resistance spirit inside and outside of Gaza. They've created a situation in which they themselves have exposed their own true agenda, and now their own population, the United States population, is completely with the Palestinian people. A year ago, if you asked someone on the street, what do you think of Palestine? They may say, I don't know, or it's a long, complicated conflict, or, oh, the Arabs and the Jews have been fighting for thousands of years. Now, when you go on the street, the majority of people will tell you, end the genocide. Wearing a keffiyeh is now, it's not a style, it's a political statement that a large number of people have taken up. It's incredible to see the shift among the American population and the contradictions inside the United States. A growing anti-imperialist sentiment inside the United States is going to change the correlation of forces, the terrain in which the United States can actually operate its imperialist agenda. Trump is coming into office in a very contested moment. And the movement over the past 15 months has played its role in really at its heart communicating what's actually going on in the ground, what the role of the United States is, and what the role of the people of the United States actually is. And that we are the ones who speak for ourselves, not the White House. When Trump comes into office, he's going to bring with him a lot of confusion because of the different things his friends in his cabinet are going to be saying. Also, his statements, he says he's anti-war, he says he's for the working class, he says all sorts of different things. He says he's for the everyday man. But our task as the movement is to continue giving that clarity. We're going to have to keep analyzing from the point of view of what is actually happening for the Palestinian people? What is the advancement of the Palestinian cause? What is the advancement of the cause of all oppressed people across the world, including inside the United States, in which we're all up against the same enemy, the same system, the same billionaire, imperialist, capitalist system that is exploiting and killing and massacring people across the world. So I think this is a moment for us to really reach out to all of those in our lives. If you're organizers, if you're an activist, to your family, to your friends, to really start explaining to people what's happening. The ceasefire is one step forward, and now there's many more steps forward to go. After the prisoner exchange, there will be many more Palestinian prisoners that need to be released. There will be a siege that needs to be lifted. There will be the full struggle for Palestinian liberation, the end of the occupation, the end of apartheid. These are all things we're still going to fight for in the Palestinian movement and unite with other sectors of struggle, other fronts of struggle that have shared interests, that also see in the liberation of Palestine their own liberation. I think that this is our path forward, and it's, the ceasefire is an incredible moment for an incredible achievement. It's an achievement for the Palestinian people, but it's not the end of the struggle. There's much more to fight for. There's a lot of losses to take stock of, and there's a lot of solidarity still that needs to be built.
Yeah, and the reconstruction of Gaza being first and foremost. Again, Layan, today, with this interview, it's January 15th, the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. Tomorrow, January 16th, marks another anniversary. That's when the U.S. Launched the invasion, the war against Iraq in 1991. Just, if you go through the calendar, war after war after war, we need a new system, as we say on this show. We need a system where the U.S. government is not endlessly at war, promoting war, sponsoring war. And the people of the country, as you're saying, can do something about it. Tomorrow, the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian youth movement, and others are having important protests around the country, talking about the need to enforce the ceasefire so that the genocide doesn't resume. On January 20th, the day Trump takes office, people in 70 cities, not just in Washington, D.C., where the inauguration is, but here in New York City, at Washington Square Park, and many other cities, the labor unions, community organizations, peace groups, many, many organizations coming together to say we need a different system, we need a new system, say no to the billionaire agenda of the Trump administration, fight against Trump not because the Democrats are the answer, but because we, the people, are the answer, building a new kind of society that meets human needs and puts the issue of peace and social justice first and foremost. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thank you.